What is aperture? Aperture is one of 3 points on the exposure triangle. This idea is what all photographers hope to master at some point in their career, and it's the perfect place to start if you're trying to learn more about how to take photos. Today I am focusing just on aperture. If you're interested in shutter speed, be sure to check out my video on that. And if you're interested in ISO, be sure to subscribe. That video is coming soon. To get started, let's pretend the room you're sitting in right now is represented by the body of a camera. Now, the lens would be a window in this room. It allows you to look through a piece of glass and see your subject clearly. And then with all of this in mind, your aperture would be like a curtain on that window. Depending on how open or closed your curtain is, the amount of light entering your room is going to change. So before we dive too deep into this, we need to learn how aperture is measured. Aperture is measured in f-stops, which is essentially just a fraction in disguise. A typical fraction, you'll see something like 1/4, and that represents 1/4. But for an aperture, you will see something like f/4. The f represents the focal length of the lens you're using. If I am using a lens with 100mm focal length and shooting at an aperture of f4, I am creating a photo that has an aperture of 1/4 of 100mm. f/4. So even though something like f4 feels like it should be a smaller aperture than f22, for example, it's actually the opposite because they're fractions. So taking this back to our room analogy, if the curtain on your window is super small, we'll call it f22, there's going to be a lot of light still able to come through your window, and maybe even too much light. This is exactly what's going to happen with your photos. A small aperture is going to result in a brighter image, and a large aperture, like f4, is going to let in less light, and your image will be darker. This is why photographers who take photos in a really dark environment, like the night sky, will use a very small aperture to compensate for that darkness and let in more light to their camera to brighten up their image. Now, the brightness of your image is only one of the two major impacts changing your aperture will have on your image. The other is your depth of field. If you're unfamiliar, depth of field represents the amount of your image that is sharp versus blurry. Now, you may be asking, why would I want my photos to be blurry? And the best way to answer this is to look at different types of photography. Something like landscape photography, you don't want much blur. You're trying to capture a very large subject that's going to fill the whole image, and you want all of it to be sharp. You're going to use a small aperture, something like f22. But if we look at portrait photography, a lot of photographers will use a large aperture, like f4, so that way their subject is sharp and in focus, and the background behind them, that can sometimes be distracting and take away from the subject, is blurry. This will highlight the person and make them stand out from the background. Of the 3 points on the exposure triangle, I would say aperture is probably the most difficult to get a firm grasp of. This is because a lot of the aspects kind of have opposite relationships with one another, and the fractions can make it all a bit confusing. I've put together a little guide that often helps me if I'm confused in a moment while I'm shooting. There's a link in the description. It's completely free, no signups or anything required, and it's also wallet size, so you can bring it wherever without having to worry about losing it. A couple last bonus tips here. On most DSLR cameras, you will have the option to shoot in aperture priority mode. This is displayed with an A or AV on your mode dial, and it will allow you to change just the aperture settings while your camera adjusts the rest of your settings to create a properly exposed image. It's an easy way to experiment with the depth of field effect that aperture will have on your images. The last thing I've got is to keep an eye on what lens you're using while adjusting your aperture. Every lens has a different limit on how large or small the aperture can get, and this is typically included in the name of the lens. Usually you'll see something like f4 or f2.8, and this represents how large the aperture can get while using this lens. Lenses with a super large aperture like 1.2 will be able to shoot in much darker environments, and these lenses are almost always more expensive because they require much larger pieces of glass to make. These are the best beginner tips to help get started and learn how aperture affects your images. And the number one way to practice these is just to get out and shoot. Experiment with different apertures, try new things. You can only read and hear people talk about these so many times before. You really just have to get out and practice it yourself. If you guys have any questions or comments about the tips in this video, be sure to let me know down below and I'll get back to you right away. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.